Welcome, everyone. So good to see you on this early spring day. It feels like one of the first really warm days, at least this afternoon, in Barre, Massachusetts. So my name is William Edelglass, and I serve as Director of Studies here at the Barre Center for Buddhist Studies in Barre, Massachusetts, which is on the traditional homelands of the Nipmuc people, Nipmuc Nation. And before introducing our speaker, Pierce Salguero, I'd like to give you some sense of how our evening is going to unfold. And first, let me say that if you would like to have closed captions, so if you'd like to have written, the words written on the bottom of your Zoom screen, you can go to More, there are the three dots at the bottom of the Zoom, and go up to CC where it says Captions and click on that button. And you'll get the live transcript. So tonight, we already have somebody who's raised their hand. Maybe if you have questions, you can either send an email to contact@buddhistinquiry.org, or you can send a chat to BCBS Jaimin. And Jaimin, I am so grateful. Thank you so much for your work behind the scenes to make this flow smoothly. So for much of the evening, I'll be asking questions to Pierce. And if you have a question that you would like to ask Pierce, you can chat it to me, send it to me in the chat, and time permitting, I will try to ask Pierce as many of the questions that arise from the group as possible. So before we get started, I would like to invite Jaimin to make it possible for everyone to chat to everyone else. And maybe you could just put in the chat a greeting to everyone and say where you're calling in from. And you can wave to everyone to say hello as we are together this evening. You can just, La Mesa, California. Welcome, Victoria. Good to see you. Vermont, Albuquerque, Vancouver, our Canadian friends. We actually love you up in Canada. We do not want you to be part of us. Indianapolis, Maryland, the Upper Valley of Vermont. Australia, Brisbane, welcome. So glad to see you. El Cerrito, California. It is a remarkable thing that we can all be together on this Zoom call. Thank you so much. And I'm very glad that we can be together on this Zoom call with Pierce Salguero. And I personally have really enjoyed all the times that Pierce and I have talked, because I feel like I learned so much from him, and he has so many provocative perspectives on things that I like to think about. He has a background in anthropology and cognitive science, and spent a number of years in his 20s in Asia, training both in traditional Thai medicine and also in Buddhism. He was briefly ordained in the Thai forest tradition. Bali, Indonesia, welcome. And after his studies in traditional Thai medicine and the Thai forest tradition, he went to Johns Hopkins to do his PhD in history of medicine, with a focus on the intersection of Buddhism and medicine. And I don't mean to make you feel self-conscious, but I think in the scholarly community, Pierce is widely regarded as the leading scholar in the West on the history of Buddhism and medicine. And to justify that claim a little, here's a few of his scholarly writings. Last year's Buddhist Healing in the Modern World, published by the University of Hawaii Press. The Global History of Buddhism and Medicine, published by Columbia. Buddhist Healing in Medieval China and Japan, published by Hawaii. Buddhism and Medicine, an anthology of modern and contemporary sources, published by Columbia. Buddhism and Medicine, an anthology of pre-modern sources, translating Buddhist medicine in medieval China, and his first book, Traditional Thai Medicine, Buddhism, Animism, Yoga, and Ayurveda. And Pierce is also very interested in the experience of advanced practitioners. And our conversation tonight will be exploring some of his current research projects that investigate what one might think of as non-dual experience. So welcome, Pierce. I'm really grateful that you're joining us. And maybe to start, you could give a sense of your trajectory. You have a very unique background. And maybe you could start with how you came to the study of Buddhism.
Yeah, great. Hi, everybody. Nice to meet you. Nice to see you. And William, it's great to be here with you again. Likewise, I always really enjoy our conversations. So, yeah, thank you for the invitation. So I think you gave the story of my kind of early meanderings through academia, looking for something. I wasn't quite sure what I was looking for. And then I wound up in Thailand, as you said, kind of immersed in the practice of learning the practice of both Thai medicine and Buddhism at the same time. And for me, those were two very intertwined objects of study. When I was in the monastery, I was observing the use of traditional medicine by the monks. And when I was in the Thai medicine school, I was observing the rituals and meditations and everything else that was, the ways that Buddhism were incorporated into the healing. And so for me, as a young 20-something person, um, that's what I thought Buddhism was. I thought Buddhism and traditional medicine were completely intertwined, and were part of the same thing. I only learned later, coming back to the United States and going into graduate school and all of that, that these were considered to be two radically different bodies of knowledge that should be studied by different disciplines, right? So we need historians of medicine to study the medicine, or medical anthropologists to study the medicine, and we need religious studies scholars or Buddhist studies scholars to study the Buddhism. So I think really the rest of my career has sort of been pushing back against that bifurcation and looking at ways that healing and health and spirituality are intertwined, and always have been within the Buddhist tradition. So the books that you have listed represent what to me I think of as the first half of my academic career, even though the last book that you mentioned was just published last year. In my thinking, I'm already, because usually publications are a couple years behind your thinking. So in my thinking, I've already shifted into phase two of my career. Um, and 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 that's a move from thinking about systems of knowledge like Buddhist approaches to health and healing. So, I've been studying the repertoires of rituals and all of the kinds of practices that were done historically as well as today by Buddhist communities. So it's a shift from that kind of work to focusing on the experiential, the phenomenology of, like you said, of advanced spiritual practice. And the bridge between these two kind of halves of my career was the discovery of the very extensive Buddhist literature on the potentially negative side effects of Buddhist practice. I know this is something that's sort of like starting to percolate in the Western kind of understanding of Buddhism. People like Willoughby Britton and others are talking about studies that are showing that there may be some adverse events that people experience. And I gave a presentation for BCBS last year, I think it was, maybe it was 2 years ago, on Asian Buddhist ideas historically about those types of phenomena. It turns out that there's tons of literature in the Buddhist tradition related to exactly that question. How do challenges arise? How do we differentiate between sort of ordinary challenges, challenging experiences in meditation versus crises that need intervention? So there's a lot of writing about that throughout the Buddhist historical record. A lot of thinkers have given us ideas about how to diagnose those problems, prevent them, treat them, and so forth. So that was kind of my bridge topic. But then once I landed in sort of the study of advanced meditation and spiritual practice, and what kinds of experiences people have in those contexts, I became interested in not just looking at the negative side effects, but sort of looking at the full picture of different kinds of experiences that people have. And so I've sort of, in this now new endeavor, I have teamed up with a social scientist colleague of mine, and we're doing a phenomenological study of the kinds of experiences that people have. We're looking at people's reports, self-reports, about the different varieties of experiences that they've had, and we're looking at this over a large sample size and over a long period of time to try to try to identify patterns, maybe correlations between what people say when they're deeply invested in Buddhist practice versus when they're very deeply invested in some other kind of spirituality, whether it's you know yoga practice or some Hindu practices and so forth. My focus is really I maintain a focus on Asian traditions. I don't know very much about Western traditions, but we've been interviewing a large number of people who are practitioners of a wide range of Asian and Asian influenced traditions, and just kind of really investigating the similarities and differences between their spiritual experiences, and trying to come up with some models and some ways of talking about those comparisons that are um, more phenomenological. So we're not doing brain studies. There's a lot of people doing that kind of work. We're really looking at how people are understanding their experiences, describing their experiences, and whether there are patterns there, and whether there are um, whether there are patterns and commonalities that are worth exploring.
Great. Thank you, Pierce. I'm curious how you found the people that are participants in your studies.
Yeah, so I've spent a couple of years doing background work on this, sort of like getting to know the spirituality communities, the North American spiritual communities, really actually Anglophone spiritual communities, because we do include a lot of it's English speaking people from around the world, but the studies do tend to have more, US being the most, Canada being the second, UK being the third, and then Australia, New Zealand, and then other English speakers being, um, you know, progressively. We have some, but fewer and fewer of those. So I spent a couple of years getting the lay of the spiritual community, the spiritual scene, doing a lot of reading, a lot of, listening to podcasts, a lot of YouTubes, a lot of things like that to sort of understand the shape of the movement at the moment. So for different studies, we have a couple different studies running, and for different studies, the selection criteria is different. But for the advanced spiritual experiencers, which are the ones that I think we're going to be talking about the most today, we did identify the some pretty well established spiritual teachers, and then from them went with word of mouth recommendations for other people that the teachers identified as being at a certain level of experience, or a certain level of development, spiritual development. Every system has its different language for this, but most of these systems have a sort of a path that's recognized as certain stages. And so we were really looking for individuals who are being identified within their tradition as people who are at the end of the path. So when whatever language that is, expressed in those different traditions. So that's who the study includes. We managed to find 100 people. I think we have 101 at the moment, people that we interviewed, who their tradition identifies them as being, at the far end of their path.
So they've been on the path that they're on or practicing for a number of years typically.
Yeah, I'm I'm not, we're not at the point where I'm going to be sharing like actual statistics from the study, because that would be, I will come back once we've finished the interviews and done the data analysis, and I could give you all of the sort of
Yeah.
statistics. So the average time of practice, is a number that I'm not able to give you off the top of my head at the moment. But the study includes, this is one of the things that I'm interested in looking at is the study includes people who have been practicing for decades, but it also includes people who apparently reportedly experienced extremely rapid development in just a matter of a couple of years. And so that's one of the things that we're interested in looking at
Mhm.
is, are there common features to the people who have these very rapid um, trajectories of advancement versus people who, have been practicing for decades? If they're describing the same experiences, the same phenomenology, is there a difference in their trajectories, and what those differences are? Is something we're interested in looking at. And so we're not only looking at the experiences that they're reporting, we're also looking at things like ethical development, things like health status, things like challenges along the way, things like, other how does this manifest in their lives, and other kinds of factors to try to identify some of those some of those differences or commonalities between people.
Sounds like rich conversations to be had with the
Yeah,
participants.
I think what we're doing is, so if I could just say in a nutshell what we're trying to contribute to the literature, the kind of the scholarly literature on this is, the scholarly literature so far has really largely been focused on sort of like spiritual or mystical or religious experiences is the language, but looking at individual events. So looking at the phenomenology, looking at the brain science, looking at descriptions of spiritual experiences as single events. And what we're doing is taking seriously the tradition's own language, that this is not about a single event, but it's actually about a trajectory of awakening or a trajectory of development, or whatever the language is. That there's a most of these traditions have some kind of process that's taking place over time. And so what we've wanted to do is to take that seriously as a starting point. And let's assume that there is a process that takes place. And so we were looking for people who have, not just had a spiritual experience, but have had what they describe as an awakening process that has culminated in something. Um, so that's something unusual in the literature, to be framing the study like that, as a sort of a long-term study looking at people's process over time. So that's what we're doing that's new.
Great. Thank you. So before we go into what people have been reporting, I'm wondering if there's anything you want to share that might be helpful to keep in mind before we go into a more specific account of different descriptions of non-duality.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a couple things come to mind that I could say. I mean, one of them is, why are we focusing on the term non-duality? And that is because in the sort of the community that we're studying, the community is using a variety of Asian terms depending on which tradition they come from. So Theravada Buddhists will use Pali, and other kinds of Buddhists will use Tibetan or Sanskrit or Chinese or Japanese. We have people from an Advaita or Neo-Advaita context that'll be using Sanskrit terms. People from all sorts of different backgrounds, using all kinds of different terminology. But when we're doing our conversations with them, we are really emphasizing English language terms, in discussing the phenomenology. Um, and so what we're finding is when people are, people say, "Oh, I experienced, jhana." Okay, well, what is that like for you? What was the phenomena like? What was the experience like? Then they start using English words to describe that, and then they start to give us descriptions that sound similar or that can be compared against other kinds of descriptions from other kinds of traditions. So we are very much um, in the camp of people who approach different religious traditions as having similarities between them. So what we're looking for here is not philosophical similarities. We're not looking for doctrinal similarities. We're not looking for similarities in how these traditions understand reality, right? Ontological similarities. We're only looking at similarities between people describing their experiences. And so the whole study is based really on what people are saying they felt like or experienced, or firsthand accounts of what changes they've gone through throughout these processes. So I don't really have anything to say about what reality is like, or what's happening in the brain during these events. We're not studying it from that perspective, and we're also not studying it from the perspective of oh, these are some scholars would approach these as being kind of like incommensurable traditions that really can't and shouldn't be compared, and we're approaching from a comparative standpoint, looking for those commonalities. Is that clear? Is
Yeah,
that
yeah. So um, this isn't a study that is making ontological or metaphysical claims about the nature of the world, or
that's right.
logical claims about what we can know from this. It's really looking at what are people experiencing who have made progress on the path in their tradition.
That's correct. Although one thing that is quite common, I can say, is that people tend to create ontologies around their experiences, right? So, like people who have experienced a certain kind of, spiritual opening will often change their ontology to match the new opening, right? So that somebody very frequently there's sort of like somebody's an atheist and then they have an experience of God and now they believe in God, right? So there's kind of a commonality in how people undergo ontological shifts that we can see in our data. But we're not going to answer like is that therefore God is real. That we have nothing to say about that. That's not the question that we're asking.
So maybe that brings us to the first type in your six kinds.
Oh, let me say one more thing. Sorry,
Yeah,
before you say that, I
go
just
ahead.
I just remembered I was going to say this too. Why focus on non-duality? Like, why is that the term or the the title of this talk? Is that non-duality is it's an English term that's being used very widely across spiritual communities. Um, it's probably not the defining term in Buddhism, but lots of Buddhists refer to non-dual experiences, non-duality as a uh, as a term. But outside of Buddhist circles, it seems to be the prevailing term that people are using to talk about spiritual experiences. And so, well, one thing that I've noticed both. So what I'm going to talk about today is drawing from both from the study that we've done, but also from all the background work that I did, like listening to podcasts and YouTubes and reading books and so forth. And what I've noticed is across the board, that people are using the term non-duality to describe their experiences. But then when you actually ask about the phenomenology, or they talk about, or you read about the phenomenology, they're referring to different things. And so I think my initial pitch to you, William, was it 11 types of non-duality? I think I said I would talk about. And then we decided maybe six was enough for, for a 90-minute session. But maybe I'll come back and do the rest of them in some future session. But yeah, so everybody's using the term non-duality to describe certain kinds of experiences. But these, when you ask about the phenomenology, when they start to talk about what they're actually experiencing, then it seems to me that we're not we're hearing different things. Oh, I just realized I didn't name my collaborator. His name is Luciano Mello, and he's a visiting scholar at Penn State University, where I'm also employed. So we together have noticed that this word non-duality has a lot of different it points to a lot of different things for different people, and so that was yeah, the idea behind this talk was to give a little bit of uh, context and nuance around the term non-duality.
Great. Let's start. So the first kind in your typology you describe as oneness or the collapse of objects. What is going on with that type of non-duality? Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So first I want to say these names of non-duality for the different kinds of non-duality are very provisional. I haven't decided with Luciano, like this isn't what we're necessarily going to name them in any kind of publication that we do. But the term oneness, I think, captures many people use this term, so that's one reason to use it. It kind of captures this initial first type of non-duality. And so this is referring to I call it the collapse of objects, or the what remains when what in this subject object kind of division that people will describe. This is kind of the prevailing mode that people will describe their experience as, is I'm the seer, and I see the object, the seen thing over there is an object that's separate from me. That's kind of the standard way that people talk about perception. Um, the experience of oneness is when the object side of that subject object collapses, and what you're left with is an experience that everything is awareness, everything is the subject, everything is conscious. So depending on the everything is consciousness. So depending on the language, people will use different terminology. Um, you know, I am awareness, I'm consciousness, everything is conscious, it's consciousness, there's only consciousness. Many people, if they're steeped in a Hindu kind of background, they'll talk about Brahman or God, everything is God. Everything exists within God, everything's made out of God, everything's made out of awareness, everything's made out of consciousness. Those are just some kind of like common ways of talking about this. Um, there was one more thing I was going to say, but it's kind of slipped past me. So go ahead and ask me a follow up. Trying to think of what it was I was going to say.
Well, one follow-up is in this account or in this experience that is being described, is there perception?
Right.
And what is that perception like if there is perception?
Yes. Okay. So good, good. And I just remember the thing I was going to say. The thing I was going to say is that each one of these, maybe I should have said this before we started the list as well, but each one of these can be had as a temporary experience, but then it also can be stabilized into an ongoing way of seeing the world. So it can be had as a a result of meditation or spiritual practice. It can be a very intense kind of like shift into this kind of perception, which may last for a little while and then fade out. But then it can also be brought back, and somebody can be oscillating between sort of ordinary way of seeing and oneness, and then eventually stabilize into oneness, so that that's their ongoing experience. Stabilizing a state into a trait, you could say.
Mm.
Right. So the each one of these non-duality each one of these non-dualities has like layers of depth to them. So there's layers of the intensity or the totality of the oneness, you could say in this case. There's some people will describe, you know, I am awareness. And then there's all of these objects that are appearing within awareness, right? So that has a certain kind of um, it has a certain kind of ontology behind it. It has a certain kind of perceptual uh, setup behind it, where there's an I, there's an identification or identity with the awareness, and then there's these objects that arise within that container of awareness, or the objects are made out of awareness or made out of consciousness. So some people have that, which I would say is like the lighter version of this, and then the more in-depth version of oneness is the identification, the I am oneness disappears, and this duality between like the awareness and the objects fuses, and then they'll say something like there is only awareness, there is only God, there is only Brahman. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Um, it feels a little bit like a Yogacara account, not
So
to not to move to the metaphysical epistemological, but in a Buddhist context, that's what comes to mind.
I would love it and really, really appreciate like your commentary as a Buddhist, as a philosopher of Buddhism, to put those words out there like that, and help me to label these with Buddhist terms, because I'm not a philosopher, and so for me this is very phenomenological, but I really would love to hear what you might.
Well, my comment here would be that so if you have Nagarjuna and emptiness is the emptiness of the essence or idea that we mentally impute onto things. When the Yogacharans come along, emptiness is the emptiness of the duality between subject and object. So you have, um, they talk about three natures. So you have the nature of the thing um, that we take to be a given, and we recognize that it's imagined, is the imagined nature. And then we recognize awakening is, in some sense, the experience of the non-duality between what we imagine and our awareness. And so,
So this would be non-duality between those things, where the one is collapsed into the awareness, right? So
right,
the
so that would be awakened experience and for a yogacharan
right.
um, orientation.
Good, because that's a good contrast with the next one, right?
Yes,
Which is the collapse the other direction.
great. Why don't we? Maybe we should go to the next one just to. 'Cause I think that will be. I mean, okay. Here, there's another. This might be a little weird for folks, but there's another. Um, actually, I don't know if this is. Um, you tell me if this is the non-duality. So, one of the things that classical phenomenology has said is that consciousness is constituting. That is, we constitute the meaningfulness of objects. And one way of thinking about awakening in a Buddhist context traditionally is that it is precisely the pause in constituting. We're kind of constantly generating um, meaning in a way that constricts our consciousness. And maybe you want to draw on this, maybe not, but Jeffrey Hopkins has a wonderful article on 5 instances in which Tibetans talk about the lack of the constituting activity. So one is sneezing, fainting, falling asleep, sneezing, fainting, falling asleep, orgasm, and death. And those are moments when the constituting activity stops. That's why I mean, death is important, but orgasm also important in a tantric context because that is a moment when our constituting activity is no longer active. And that is something like what awakening could be like. So there's
I might
another.
let's 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 bracket that and come back to that at number six
Okay,
and tell me if that's what I'm talking about there.
great. Let's go on to number two.
Okay.
What is the second kind of
So the second kind is the opposite.
non-duality?
So the first one was the collapse of the objects, right? And where what's left is standing as a subject that's awareness or consciousness or God or Brahman or whatever. It could be identified with. It can just be like everything is consciousness. So this is the flip side where it's the collapse the other direction. The subject drops out. So in that subject object duality, the sort of normal, pre-awakened way of seeing things, quote unquote pre-awakened way of seeing things, there's a subject and the object. So this is the subject dropping out, and there's only the objects left. So I call this non-self. I'm not meaning to necessarily only invoke the Buddhist notion of anatta, but also sort of the way that other traditions speak about this. This does seem to be the kind of the primary direction of Theravada Buddhism seems to be in this direction. Other forms of Buddhism as well focus on this. Maybe you can say more about that, William. But the idea here, the people frequently actually quote the Bahia Sutta, which is a Theravada text that there's a lot, there's, it, it's it's a famous line that gets repeated a lot that in the scene there's only the scene. So scene SEEN. So like in the object that's seen, there's only that object. There's no self, there's no viewer, there's no witness, there's no consciousness, there's no awareness, there's just the object itself. So this is the collapse of the subject, leaving the object in place. And so again, like lighter and deeper versions of this kind of experience, in the lighter versions of the experience, people will say, um, awareness, they might experience awareness arising as an object within the field of objects. It could be that awareness is one among many. There's experience of vision and hearing and other kind of sensations, and there's experience of awareness that's arising as well within the field of objects, not as a viewer but as an object. And then other people will sort of describe the complete lack of awareness, complete lack of a viewer or a witness of any kind, and it's just objects.
So the first one was the collapse of the object in the subject-object divide. And the second one is the collapse of the subject in the subject-object divide. I'm curious, Pierce, just to step a little bit farther out for a moment. If you think that the experience that is being described is maybe the same experience, but just two different ways of describing it. That is the collapse of the subject and the collapse of the object. Are they different ways of describing something that people have because of their own interpretive frameworks, the concepts of their tradition that they have to work with? Or do you think they're really two different experiences? Or is that
Yeah.
beyond this?
I mean, my opinion, which is only an opinion, is that these are two different kinds of experiences. That there's a real phenomenological difference between these two experiences that comes across in the way that people describe it. The languages being used is very different. The kinds of metaphors that people are grasping for, the kinds of affective and emotional kind of tone that sometimes these experiences can have is quite different. Um, in the first case, the oneness experience, most people experience that as very pleasant. Most people experience that as being a feeling of connection and intimacy that leads into a feeling of being enfolded into some kind of unitary oneness. It's people describe that as being very positive. non-self and the collapse of the subject, and particularly in people who experience this very dramatically, very quickly, is often described in dystopian terms. Loss of self not being a pleasant experience, being something, that's destabilizing, that feels unpleasant. And this kind of experience is often, I, I want to scare people away from this kind of experience, but the kind of the very rapid experience of the subject bottoming or collapsing out without the Buddhist context or the doctrinal context that this is something that could happen. If that just happens spontaneously to somebody in a spiritual practice and they aren't expecting it, that frequently will result in some kind of, perceived anyway, spiritual emergency of some kind, that this is a really unpleasant, adverse experience that I need to fix because something's broken. So just given you may be right, like ontologically, it may be the same exact thing happening in the brain, but in terms of the the perception, the emotion, so like I said, the affect, the emotion around it, the interpretations people give it, and the way that they describe the phenomenology, they seem to be quite different.
Yeah. I resist going to the brain to give the definitive,
Me
even
too.
though neuroscience has enormous authority. But just
Yeah.
again, to bring in a little bit of context for that one, in the kind of classical path of insight um, account, there is this moment of destabilization of the self that is unpleasant, as it's just part of the path of insight, one of the stages. Um, but maybe destabilization takes us to the third
Yeah.
form of non-duality. What's the third form of non-duality?
Yeah. So this one, I gave it the temporary title potentiality, and this is something, we might change, of course, all of these titles, but so this is the previously we talked about the collapse of one or the other side of the non of the subject object distinction, leaving the other one in place. Um, but the potentiality is the destabilization of both subject and object at the same time. So this is an experience of both the subject and the object being um, no longer solid, no longer dependable, no longer constant, and now being destabilized, it becomes dynamic, it becomes slippery, it becomes non-definitive, both subject and object at the same time. A lot of times people start talking about how everything, all of reality seems to not actually manifest. It doesn't actually appear. It's sort of like blipping in and out of existence. They're both the witness and the objects, right? Both the consciousness or the awareness and the objects are slippery, unpin downable, unfindable. Um, it's not that nothing's happening, but they're just all sort of like fuzzy and coming in and out in an unstable and dynamic way. Uh, some traditions talk about this in terms of energy, in terms of like it's a Kundalini explosion of the whole universe, or it's lots of energetic, pulsation coming in and out really rapidly. Um, Perception uh, is pixelated. A lot of people say it becomes very sort of like ethereal, ephemeral, kind of mirage-like. And again, this is both kind of temporary practice, experiences as a result of practice, but it also can be, stabilized into an ongoing, ordinary way, a new normal way of perceiving reality.
That one sounds like it could also be unpleasant at times, I suppose, or
Yes,
challenging
that's
in
right.
some ways.
Yeah, I think, I think, yeah, numbers 2, 3, and 4 are particularly if they, So what we're finding in the study is that a lot of times people have these kinds of experiences without context. So this is coming out of the spiritual emergency literature and some of the meditation related adverse effect literature, that people who don't have context for these kinds of experiences, maybe they're in a basic mindfulness stress reduction course and nobody's ever told them that, Buddhism, that these techniques are used in Buddhism to have a non-self experience. They're in a basic mindfulness course, and for whatever reason, that person, however they're configured, for that person, they have, one of these experiences in that kind of context. And they weren't expecting it. Or it can even be just people, fooling around on the internet watching YouTubes or whatever, and they suddenly, give themselves an experience, or maybe they have absolutely no exposure to spirituality whatsoever. These things just kind of happen spontaneously. We're finding a lot of those kinds of accounts. So any of these experiences, when you have them out of context and you're not thinking in terms of spirituality, you might think that something's wrong with your brain. You have a brain tumor. You might think that there's something wrong with your eyes, or it may put you into a confusion. Um, so yeah, so we do get we have had numerous reports of that kind of thing happening spontaneously without context, and then people are searching for context. They discover spiritual ideas, and then the ideas can help them make sense of what they've previously experienced. So it can happen that way, kind of backwards
Sus-
the way that
I suspect there are plenty of people having these sorts of experiences on the meditation apps. I've met some people who have had really extraordinary experiences on the apps, um,
yeah.
but not really known what was going on.
Yeah, I mean, so that's the topic that bridged me over, like I was saying, that bridged me over from the health related stuff to this kind of stuff we're talking about today. So I can definitely talk more about those kinds of things, and I do have a study also with Luciano Mello, my collaborator, and in the study we're talking about, we have a different study about spiritual emergencies as well. So that's something that we're very interested in.
So what about the fourth one, the formless?
Right. So formlessness, yeah, but maybe that's the right word, maybe not. Maybe we could call it, like emptiness, if we want to talk in Buddhist terms, although that word means a lot of different things for different Buddhists. What I'm talking about here is the previous one is the destabilization of subject and object, and so it makes reality kind of like blipping in and out, and things are very sort of like pixelated and energetic and dynamic. Formlessness would be the collapse of both the subject and object at the same time, and leaving nothing, right? When both the subject and the object collapse, there's just kind of like a blank. So in some traditions, they talk about this blanking out as um, a deep kind of tranquil stillness, a void, some kind of deep sleep like state. Um, and in some traditions, it seems, or in some practice communities, it seems they talk about this as being almost like, you went under anesthesia, and it's 1 minute you're conscious, and the next minute you're conscious, the next second, one second you're conscious, the next second you're conscious, but 40 minutes passed in between with zero experience whatsoever. So there's a little slight difference. Again, I think it's like uh, in terms of depth, you could say there's like a lighter version of this and a deeper version of this. So, the lighter version of this would be like I experience, there's some kind of experience of a void for 40 minutes, and the other would be this sort of a complete gap in your consciousness. So yeah, in some terms that people, some technical terms that people use, I think cessation is often used in English, and there's nirodha, and it is another term that people are familiar with, as well as nirvikalpa samadhi. People use those kinds of terms. to refer to this sort of experience. And I'm trying to sort of like cluster those kinds of experiences together and talk about them as the collapse of both subject and object and the complete absence of experience.
Great. Thank you, Pierce. And just a reminder, if anybody has questions that they would like to pose to Pierce, please feel free to send them in a chat to me, and I'll be keeping track of them. And when we get there, I'll ask Pierce your questions. Okay, so the fifth kind of non-duality that you have
Yeah.
had reported to you by your participants.
Yes. So this is still very, like I said, is preliminary data analysis wise. We're not making any sort of strong claims, any kind of, percentages and so forth, or just everything's very provisional. Although I should say, I did look at our data specifically on to see how many Buddhists we have in the sample, because I was saying this is a wide sample from across different traditions, and out of 101 interviews that we have to date, we have 28 Buddhists. So I guess it's about just under a third of the sample, Buddhists of different types. So that's one statistic I can share because I just looked at that. But in terms of the other kinds of statistics, I want to reserve that for a future presentation where we get into more detail about the study once we've finished the data collection and finished the data analysis. However, what I can say is that there seems to be in terms of the longer term trajectory of people's awakening process, there seems to be what we're finding is that people are talking about the kinds of experiences that we've been talking about so far. So oneness, non-self, potentiality, and formlessness, that these kinds of experiences happen um, kind of kicking off the process of awakening that we're looking at, this process of spiritual development over time. And over time, it seems that the fifth type of non-duality that I'm going to talk about seems to happen later, like further down the road. And we're calling it omni-perspectival non-duality. It's a little bit of a mouthful. Multi-perspectival non-duality. So this again, the titles, the names can change, but here what we're looking at is people who have had multiple types of spiritual experiences. Maybe they've experienced oneness, maybe they've experienced non-self, maybe they've experienced cessations. At a certain point in their process of development, the process of awakening, they come to see these different experiences as being these multiple ways of seeing or multiple ways of experiencing reality. They come to be present simultaneously. And so you get people talking about reality being multifaceted. If they're Buddhist, they might be talking about how nirvana and samsara are the same thing. They might be talking about emptiness and fullness being the same thing. They might be talking about, or emptiness and form, sorry, being the same thing. Um, reality is multifaceted, and you can change your perspective on it, and you can see it as being one through oneness. You can see it through non-self. You can see it being potentiality. You can see it being formlessness. So it's sort of like a meta level non-duality, you could say, right? The duality between nirvana and samsara is reconciled because I can see it in both ways at the same time.
Okay, just to put in a little Buddhist context, the Tintai school of Chinese Buddhism very much has this kind of a emphasis on
People really like quoting the opening of the Heart Sutra for this. Even if they have no context for Buddhism, they'll say emptiness is form, form is emptiness. And another thing people really like to quote with this is the chapter one of the Tao Te Ching, the scripture
um,
Taoism that talks about the Tao and and the Tao is formless, but then there's the objects, right? And then it says that both of those are the same thing, and that's the greatest mystery is how they're both the same thing. So yeah, there's definitely some um, greatest hits scripturally that people like to quote, but regardless of what tradition they've come from, they sort of resonate with these things. Yeah.
Okay, we are getting some really interesting questions. Um, and they're also questions that I share.
Yeah,
So maybe let's wrap up the sixth one and then we'll get to some of these questions.
sounds great. So the sixth one, if the fifth one is omni-perspectival or multi-perspectival, having all these different, being able to shift perspective and see reality in all kinds of different ways, simultaneously or one at a time. Uh, post-perspectival non-duality is it's another mouthful, but this is the temporary name giving to the uh, the 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 different kinds of perspectives that could be seen in different ways now dropping out. Um, each one, the way that people describe this is quite particular, quite unique. A lot of different attempts to describe this. Actually, all of the previous types of non-duality that I've been talking about, using all these words to describe, everybody pretty much across the board says this is really hard to describe with words. I'm just pointing at, something here. I'm not actually capturing it with my words. So I think that applies to everything I've said before so far. But this last one is the one where people just are really like, nothing really can be said about this any longer. Like this is the point where language and concepts just are not able to be. They can't even point anymore to what's being what kind of experience is being had here. The way that people talk about this is to uh, they talk about the dropping of the overlays, the dropping of the filters, the dropping of the perspectives that they previously had. Often the kind of like the dramatic sort of like openings that people had that stabilized into certain ways of experiencing reality, that those fall away and are no longer being able to really be found, or no longer really being that relevant. And people will say that there is that all ways of seeing have been dropped, all ways of framing have been dropped, all perspectives have been dropped. Yeah, maybe I'll stop there, see what you think about that.
Great, thank you. Um, one of the questions actually addresses what you were just talking about, and that is the challenge of talking about, writing about, researching, having conversations about that which is said to be beyond the limits of language and concepts. And I'm wondering if you want to share anything that you've been thinking about how to talk about this. Um,
Yeah, I mean, this is from one perspective, you could say this whole presentation is an exercise in futility. There's every one of these experiences can't be captured with the words, but I think we know that about words already. Like you can't even capture the taste of a strawberry, accurately convey that to somebody who's never tasted a strawberry. You can't even do that with words, never mind these kinds of very you know um, unusual experiences, let's say. So yeah, so words here, I think are as a scholar, that's this, William, like that's the paint that we use to paint our pictures on the canvas, right? Are these words, and we're using words to point at things. um, even knowing that the words can't really actually capture or pin down the things that we're using them to describe. So but I still think there's a utility in this kind of work because it's pointing out certain patterns, it's pointing out certain similarities that I think are worth knowing about and worth investigating. So yeah, using words lightly and not being, anytime you use a word, it's going to reify a whole worldview and a whole sort of, universe. But if we can use them lightly, knowing that that's happening and trying to hold them really lightly, I think that that's the best we can do. Or we can just sit in silence, which some people might prefer. But scholars like William and I would not. I don't know. I feel like we have to try to talk about these things. So that's what I'm doing.
So one question that came in,
Hmm.
which,
Oh, William, wait.
yeah,
You had a question earlier also. Like I don't mean to derail you from that
yeah,
question.
go ahead.
You had a question earlier about the Tibetan
Oh,
five.
yes. And the letting go of the constituting activity of consciousness.
And I was just thinking now that I've described number six, that might be where the letting go of constituting consciousness would lie. Am I right about that?
Yeah,
That's
that sounds um
the it's like the 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 act of participating in the construction of reality that drops away, that there's no longer a kind of like an overlay or like a perspective taking being done. That is
right when it's not constituting the meaningfulness of particular objects. So there's that painting on the wall behind me, or the lamp, or the light emanating from the lamp over there, or the hallway, or the door. All of those things are meaningful to me because my consciousness is constituting them as meaningful. And in this account, what would be underlying it would be an open awareness that is non-specific. Um, I don't know if that would be.
that sounds like number one to me. The objects are arising in an awareness or against the backdrop
The
of
objects are no longer there.
the objects are no longer there.
There's no differentiation between objects, if you will.
Okay. Yeah. So, but yet it's too much to say that nothing is happening, or or would that view say nothing's actually happening?
Yeah, these are. I don't think it would. One would say that nothing is happening.
I don't think so either. Because if it could be said by this position that I don't know, I'm asking you about, but if that position could say nothing is happening, then it would be number four, the formless or the emptiness.
Uh-huh.
If that position would say you can't define, like it can't be said if something is happening or not, because it can't be looked for, it can't be seen. There's that constitution, that act of constitution isn't happening. So like who knows what if it's there or not, right? That's more like number six, post perspectival.
Yeah. So here's here's a question that um, someone posed, and that is how um, well, if you've been looking into psychedelic experiences and what relationship they might have with this, and maybe I would broaden that to in meditation is often related to hypnosis or um, drug induced or psychedelic or plant medicine induced
Yeah.
experiences. And I'm wondering, and this person is wondering how that fits into the
Yeah.
work you're doing.
Yeah. So again, like without getting into particular specific percentages and so forth, a fair number of the participants in the study have at some point used a psychedelic. By no means everybody, but what what is the kind of the defining feature of our, you could say, our inclusion criteria for the study. So the defining feature that we were looking for in people is that they are participating in an Asian or Asian influenced spiritual tradition. So we do not have in the study people who are strictly only doing psychedelics and not don't see themselves as being part of an Asian um, spiritual tradition, right? So people may have done psychedelics at some point, but they're primarily, see themselves as being practicing Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, and related practices. So that that's kind of the inclusion criteria for the project. And then in terms of people's experiences, having these experiences, what's the trigger for the experience? That's a question that we have for the data analysis portion of the study when we're getting into the weeds with these people's self descriptions and their accounts here. I'm curious, do psychedelics tend to produce certain kinds of experiences? Do certain kinds of meditation tend to produce certain kinds of experiences? Do other kinds of practices like yoga or qigong or energy work or self-inquiry, the kind of stuff that people do in Advaita, or do these lead to specific types of experiences? And that's something that I don't really have any clear answers on yet. I would love to come back and talk with you more about the study after. Maybe I'll bring my collaborator as well, Luciano Mello, and we can chat with you about more of those kinds of questions, to sort of explore those, yeah, those the relationship between practice and the experiences. At the moment, I'm just describing the experiences that result. But like I said, they can happen spontaneously. It can happen from spiritual practice. Can certainly happen from psychedelics as well.
Now, there's an article that I read that I'd be happy to share with you, but it was looking at hypnosis, meditation, and psychedelics, and looking at the way that for all three, set and setting were determinative on whether it was going to be a beneficial experience or a problematic experience. And so you can have the very same experience, but in one context, in one setting, it can be
Yeah,
understood as healing and healthy and helpful. And in
yeah,
another setting, um,
yeah.
just the opposite.
I think I mean, as I was referring earlier to sort of having the experience within a context or outside of a context, right? That could help to frame it. I think we're saying the same thing. I think set and setting, and context are super important. Yeah.
So there's several questions that have to do with Buddhism in particular. Um, and I don't know that um, this is where you want to go necessarily, but I think because we are a Buddhist.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so one question is, does the discomfort from number two and number three kinds of non-duality come from the experience itself, or does it come from trying to make sense of it without a Buddhist perspective?
Yeah.
That kind of gets at what we were just talking about, but I'm curious
Yeah.
to hear your thought.
Yeah. So I think it's number two and four that are the ones that Buddhism talks the most about, right? So number two is the non-self, the collapse of the subject. So in the scene, there's only the scene, and then number four is the complete emptying out, the cessation, or the subject and object both collapsing at the same time. I think number three, the potentiality one, that the destabilization and the kind of fluctuations, energy fluctuations, that one, certainly, I mean, all of these can be talked about within Buddhism, and you would know better than me, William, what Buddhist philosophical traditions would correlate to number three. That one, I think the predominant language that at least Anglophone spiritual communities use to talk about that is in terms of Kundalini in terms of energy, in terms of prana, in terms of sort of chi. Sometimes people will use energy language to refer to that potentiality frequently. Um, right. Um, I think there are some advantages to, this is my opinion, I'm just sharing my own opinion. I think there's some advantages to having a rich, multivocal spiritual um, scene in the Anglophone world where there are all sorts of different practices and all sorts of different descriptions of experiences being given by different communities. And so one thing that we noticed, again, I can't get into specific percentages, but one thing that we noticed was very few people ever stayed within one tradition. Most people in the study started in one tradition, at least spent some time with practices that belong to another tradition, even if they came back and even if they primarily stayed within one stream, they may have borrowed practices from other places. And so this seems to be to me, just as somebody who's looked at spiritual emergencies and how that happens out of context, what I think is happening is people are reaching for practice frameworks and also theoretical frameworks to help to navigate experiences that they're having, and they're finding the resources to do that within other traditions. So it may be somebody who's a very committed Buddhist, but like Theravada Buddhist, but did some Vajrayana practice on the side for a little while to navigate certain kinds of things, or somebody who's primarily, I don't know, a Zen practitioner who did some yoga in order to deal with some kind of energetic stuff that was happening during the meditation. My own opinion is I'm a proponent of um, cognitive and doctrinal and practice flexibility, right? I'm reaching for different tools, both in terms of, body, mind practice, but also in terms of conceptual and philosophical tools
Yeah.
out there. That's just my own opinion.
Yeah, I suspect each one of these traditions, Taoist, Hindu, Buddhist, they're so capacious that they hold all these different practices. Like just thinking of Buddhist traditions, there's an enormous amount of diversity, multiplicity of practices um, within, say, Tibetan Buddhism, even Theravada Buddhism. We tend to think of insight, at least in some Theravada contexts in the West, we tend to think of insight as primarily, or jhanas or shamatha, what Theravada does. But Theravada also has its own tradition of what some people call tantric Theravada or esoteric Theravada. There are many different kinds of practices within any of these traditions, really.
Yeah, yeah, and now we have the situation where I can't see everybody's photos and names, but I'm going to assume that most people in this call are, living in Western countries. I mean, that's what I saw in the chat earlier. And speak English as their primary language. And what we have the advantage of is just a massive amount of information about all of these traditions and very adept teachers that are teaching them. And so it's like all of it's available. Um, in a way that makes it, I think, quite possible for people to really um, either to sort of gravitate towards whatever is really going to work for them, or to customize something by combining different things together, because that information is really out there, um, for and accessible for people in a way that really probably never was historically in the past.
So one question that came in is, do participants share how they interpret their experience on the path and how they continue progressing on their path and deepen their practice? That is, and there's another question about whether or not people are describing these non-dual experiences as the end of the path,
Right.
as the culmination, or is it a stage on the path? I could imagine perhaps different forms of non-duality or different categories might be more closer or farther from the end of the path in one or another particular tradition.
Yeah. 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 So I've just been presenting really kind of like the experiences and the way people talk about them and not putting them into sort of a path framework, a path structure. And that is something that we are uh, very actively interested in is modeling the path and whether how these non-dual experiences fit into a sequence and how they are experienced over time. I think is something that we're going to have a lot to say about when um, publishing and putting the results of this study out. So for the moment, what I'll say is, the way I presented it, the first four, forms of non-duality seem to be like earlier kinds of experiences that are possible to have, and then you have the fifth, the omni perspectival, where it's kind of like integrating the previous experiences that were had individually. There's kind of like an integration, and they can be experienced simultaneously, and then there's a dropping of those frameworks as the final one. That is as far as I'll get into like a shape of the progression. But that is the shape that's emerging from the data. So we'll have a lot more to say in particular about that in the near future. Luciano and I will.
So there's another question that came in, and that is, does non-dual experience give us a particular kind of knowledge about the world, or is it just fundamentally beyond words and concepts and thoroughly ineffable? Um, or is this something that is outside the research project?
I mean, so next time I come back, I will be able to probably answer that question in terms of how other people perceived it, right? So actually, I'm hearing two questions in there. One of them seems like at first it was a question about, do any of these experiences tell us about reality? And I think that's beyond certainly beyond my interests as a researcher to talk about that. But the second part of the question sounded like it might also be talking about sort of how do these types of experiences affect one's day-to-day life, ordinary life in the world, right? And that's the piece that we want to do some data analysis to really discover how people are transformed by these experiences. To what extent does it change your ethics or your behavior or your lifestyle? So our study does not include a very large number of monastics. It includes primarily lay people, almost all are lay people. I mean, some lay people live a rather reclusive life, and so there's that. But we have tended to um, include people who are living in the world, and so we do have questions about how these types of experiences over the long term have affected people's engagement. Has it led to them to withdraw more? Has it led to them become more engaged? Has it led to certain kinds of behavioral changes over time? Those are all questions that I don't have answers to right now because this study is sort of still coming together. But yeah, the next time I come back, we'll be able to talk more about that.
So there's a question about flow.
Flow.
Um, so Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's notion of flow that um, athletes and musicians and others feel
Oh,
that there's not so much challenge that you're anxious and not so little that you are um, bored, but you, like a rock climber, completely in the moment, or a musician. Um, would that be, I think the question is basically, is that a non-dual experience itself that many of us might have felt in one activity or another?
I mean, to me that's a little bit. it sounds a little bit like the post perspectival, like the last one, right? Um, what makes a flow state like that a flow state is that you are not um, conceptually involved in um, either sort of creating a self or really analyzing objects, right? You're kind of like just in it. Um, you're not separate from it, observing it. You're just sort of in the activity, and you might even kind of um, not have any sort of self-awareness or any kind of like reflective capacity while you're in it, and only later look back and say, wow, I was in a flow state, right? You're not in the flow state analyzing, oh, look at how I'm flowing. um, so that to me seems rather similar to the post perspectival, the dropping of the framing, the dropping of the what was the word that you used? Conditioning? No, constituting. What was the word that you used
Yeah,
earlier?
the constituting activity of
The
consciousness.
dropping of the constituting, the dropping of the analysis and the observation and the monitoring of reality on the moment to moment basis, and just being swept up in it, and somehow it you know all of these questions of what's the subject, what's the object, what's the relationship between them, and so forth, just sort of disappear in that flow. um so to me, I do think there's something similar there. And then what this would be referring to would be um, the capacity that some people have on the basis of long-term spiritual practice to turn that temporary experience into a permanent um, way of being in the world, right? So it would be, I think it's kind of like being in that sort of flow state 24/7 might be a good way of approximating, or a good metaphor for what that post perspectival kind of way it would be. I don't know. What do you think, William? What do you see a correlation between the dropping of the constituting and the flow state?
It's probably somewhere on a spectrum.
Yeah.
I mean, one is there may be constituting going on, but um, we only have a few minutes, and there's one question that I really want to ask you.
Okay. Yeah. I don't mean to
Um,
put you on the spot. So.
no, no, no. Um, well, I'm putting you on the spot with every question, so it's okay. Um, this is a question that's a little bit more personal. How has speaking with all these practitioners who have had these experiences, how is it affecting or impacting you personally? That is it inspiring? Is it um, impacting your own practice? You've been in Buddhist worlds of various sorts for some decades, and here you are in this particular Anglophone multi-tradition project of speaking with a bunch of people who are deep practitioners. And how is that impacting you?
Yeah.
And if you don't want to answer it, you don't have to, but there's the invitation.
Yeah, thanks for that. So, yeah, that's something I don't talk about as a scholar usually in scholarly talk. So this is a little bit of a hybrid talk, so we can get into some things like that. But yeah, so sorry, this is gonna sound like I'm promoting myself, but I want to mention that I have written a couple of books that are not scholarly books, that are sort of books for general audience. Uh, Related to Buddhism. A couple years ago, I published a book called Buddhist, and it's a book about why I've spent my entire life studying Buddhism, but do not consider myself a Buddhist. And it's sort of like a kind of a mix of some scholarly ideas and then some personal stories. And then I've recently published a book called A Lamp Unto Yourself, which is a very Buddhist title, but the book is kind of talking about, it's an introduction to spiritual practices from Buddhism, but also from a bunch of other Asian traditions, Taoism and Hinduism and so forth. And in that book, I get into even more kind of personal experience. And also I discuss a number of these um, non-dual, these types of non-duality. I discussed them in that book, although the book was written before the study. So I kind of like maybe cut it up and use different terms. I cut it up differently and use different terms than what I'm using here. The book does talk about those kinds of experiences and the kinds of practices that, one can do in order to have those kinds of experiences. So I did all of that is to say that even though I've spent my whole scholarly life sort of like, kind of in the Buddhist lane, my own practice life, my own sort of life as a practitioner of spirituality has been much broader and has combined a number of different things together. And so the research for me has been very interesting, and also as somebody who's always suspected that there's commonalities with, and uh, complementarity between these different traditions, as somebody who has myself kind of combined these traditions together in customized ways. I've found that the research to me is very validating of that kind of approach. And I think so, as somebody who's experienced a lot of different types of spiritual experiences myself, to hear from other people having similar kinds of experiences from across a whole range of different kinds of traditions, I think has been really exciting and um, yeah, validating and just continue to deepen my own curiosity about these phenomena and what they mean for people and how we've described them.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Is there any question that you wish I would have asked as we come to the end here? Anything else you want to share?
No, this has been great. I'm realizing that, it's probably like two or three more presentations that I need to give in the future with you, just to kind of cover the rest of the questions that people were asking. And yeah, like I said, I'll have more to say. Maybe I'll come on with my collaborator Luciano, and we'll come on and talk with you further about things. But
I just got a comment that said, very interesting. Hope to come back for another talk after research is complete. Smiley face. Um, so let me say a few things. First of all, thank you so much, Pierce. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And I wanted to say a little bit about how BCBS and our teachers navigate this world that is so hyper capitalistic, trying to maintain a culture that is somewhat of a counterculture to that. And the way we do that is through the practice of dana. Dana is a Sanskrit and Pali word, these South Asian Buddhist languages, and it means generosity. It's the first virtue on the Bodhisattva path, because the beginning of awakening, of non-dual experience, perhaps, for these traditions is in letting go of our attachment to things, but also making offerings to those who are in need. And so our teachers we don't have contracts with any of our teachers. They are supported by the goodwill of our community. They trust in the community to come and share what they have to offer, and our community trusts in them and the pure-heartedness of them coming to teach. And similarly, for BCBS, much of what we offer is made possible by the generosity of our community. And this allows us to give an enormous amount of scholarship to participants in our programs. Unlike many places, we basically give as much scholarship as people need to as many people who need it to make the Dharma as accessible as possible. So if you are in a tight position, as many people are, given the current circumstances of our country in the United States, there should be no sense of obligation to give. And if you feel like it's appropriate for you to give freely, there is a link that Jaimin put in the chat, the Donna link, and you can make a contribution there. And we also think of it as Donna to fill out the survey to give us a sense of what worked well for you tonight, both in the conversation Pierce and I had, and also in the BCBS communications and logistics. So we think of that as Donna because we learn from that and it can help us do better. So thank you so much for coming, everyone. It's good to see some familiar faces, and it's also good to see some of you who I hope will become friends here in Barrie on a residential retreat. And Pierce, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I really, really appreciate it and all you are doing and all you have to offer.
Yeah. Thanks again for the invitation. It was a fun conversation. Look forward to the future.
Okay. Good night, everyone. Be well. And if you're in Bali, good morning. I hope you have a wonderful day.